Now, knowing I have a bit of an interest in that country, I find that British visitors to Oman, I know some of you have been there, often comment to me on the friendliness of the Omani people and the apparent closeness that seems to exist between our two countries. Now, this is probably most obvious in the military sphere, but I think it goes deeper than that. And just before COVID, Nicola and I were invited to Oman by the then British liaison officer, General Richard Stanford, to give this same talk in the capital Muscat to a large, and I have to say scarily distinguished audience that included ministers, diplomats, service chiefs, officials. It was very humbling for me, but it did seem to demonstrate these very strong ties still remain. Now, of course, Oman has changed dramatically in the last 50 years since I was there as a soldier. And the country's relatively young population, quite rightly, focuses on the extraordinary developments that have taken place since what is sometimes called the Oman Renaissance of 1970. But there is still a respect for history and for old allies. The King and Queen are regular visitors. The King was known to be close to the late Sultan Qaboos and is clearly very fond of the country, as indeed is the Prince of Wales, who was actually one of the last official visitors to see Sultan Qaboos before he died in 2020. During one quite recent visit, the King referred to the Anglo-Oman Treaty of 1800 that states that the friendship of the British and Omanis will remain unshook till the end of time, until the sun and moon have finished their revolving career. Now, isn't that beautiful? That was written 225 years ago, and it surely must be a solid foundation for good relations. Now, what about this book? Well, the book was first published in 2011. It was revised in 2015 as a paperback and is now also on Kindle. It's an attempt to describe how a newly qualified veterinary surgeon with very little military experience, I tried to cope with a sudden and completely unexpected posting to what is probably the world's most professional and dedicated special forces. I did realise this was all quite extraordinary at the time, and I had the sense to keep a journal for 6 months, and so 35 years later, the book was the result. And I can take no credit for the title with the SAS and Other Animals. That was the brilliance of the publisher, Henry Wilson of Pen and Sword. Now, there are 2 cap badges on each of the slides that you'll see this evening, and some of you will certainly recognise the one at the top. It's that of 22 SAS. It's sometimes called the winged dagger. But actually it isn't a winged dagger, it's actually Excalibur rising from the flames. And it was designed by Corporal Bob Tate in 1941. He was one of David Stirling's original men. And the motto, of course, "Who Dares Wins," was Stirling's own. Now, the second cap badge at the bottom there is that of the Royal Army Veterinary Corps, a corps that was founded in 1881. And it has in the centre a centaur. Actually, it's the one good centaur. He's known as Chiron, the healer, half horse, half man. And he's surrounded by laurel wreaths, and the crown on top was bestowed by King George V in 1918 for exceptional services during the Great War. Now, I was delighted and incredibly honoured that the former Chief of the Defence Staff, the former Chief of the General Staff, the distinguished soldier called General Richard Dannett, agreed to write the foreword to the book. Now, some of you may remember General Dannett's famous disagreement with Prime Minister Gordon Brown, who in 2009 demanded a massive increase in the intensity of military spending in Iraq and Afghanistan, but with no additional funding from the Treasury. The General's reaction was widely publicised at the time, and I think it was particularly well depicted by The Times in October 2009. So now let me take you back to 1974. It was not a particularly happy time in UK. Ted Heath was Prime Minister, the economy was weak, a second miners' strike had led to severe power shortages, and the country went on to a 3-day working week with regular nightly blackouts and fuel shortages. IRA activity was at its most deadly, both in Northern Ireland and on the UK mainland, with the Guildford and the Birmingham pub bombs, and the atrocious M62 coach bomb that killed 12 off-duty soldiers and their families. There were bombs also that year in Westminster and in the Tower of London. It was a depressing time. But it was into this maelstrom that there arrived a rather green, naive and impressionable 26-year-old veterinary officer. I graduated as a vet at the Royal Veterinary College in April 1973 and immediately took up my short service commission with the RAVC. Now, it could never happen today, and it should never have happened then, but due to the severe shortage of army vets due to the sudden large number of working dogs needed in Northern Ireland, my Sandhurst military training was postponed. And so within 3 months of joining the Corps, I was posted to Northern Ireland, a part of what was by then a significant military theatre. I was based in Long Kesh. It was later renamed the Maze. It's a prison built on a former RAF camp. And in 1973 it housed some 1,700 IRA and UVF prisoners in the infamous H blocks that you can just make out there. It was a grim, violent and seething place with riots, dirty campaigns and hunger strikes. The Army Dog Unit had 70 or so highly trained guard dogs in the prison, and there were about another 100 or so guard and search dogs scattered around the province, and all of these were my veterinary responsibility. And my brigade pharmacy and office were a porter cabin on the periphery of the airfield. It was a 2-year posting, and a bleak prospect faced me. We lost 2 soldiers from the unit in 1973. One was blown up with his dog, and one was shot. But in due course, Christmas arrived. We'd been confined to barracks because of IRA activity, so it wasn't the cheeriest of festive seasons. But on the day after Boxing Day, my officer commanding, Jerry Quigley, called me into his office and handed me a secret signal. Now, secret signals were not something that came routinely into the lives of young veterinary officers. So I opened it with a certain degree of apprehension. And it told me that I was to be posted with immediate effect to the headquarters of 22 SAS Regiment in Hereford, and then on to BFPO 66, British Forces Post Office 66. It was classified as secret because at that time it was not in the general public domain that British forces, and in particular special forces, were operating in Oman. As an officer in the Corps, obviously I knew that over the last 3 years a series of RAVC majors had been deployed on 6-month contracts somewhere in the Arabian Gulf, but I had little idea what they were doing there, and in any case the present incumbent was supposed to be the last one. I was barely in uniform, and in any case only a quarter of the way through my 2-year posting to Long Kesh. But due to what was called the exigencies of the service, it had been decided that one further veterinary officer attachment was urgently required, and the director of the Army Veterinary Services, Brigadier Harry Orr, had decided that it was to be me. So off I went to Herefordshire, certainly with a spring in my step to be getting out of Long Kesh in the depths of winter, but also with a fair degree of trepidation. And this is the old Bradbury Lines, which is the old home of the regiment. And here I was briefed by Colonel, later General Sir Peter de la Billière, who was then commanding officer of 22 SAS. He is a quite extraordinary man. And as some of you will remember, he was later to be Commander-in-Chief of British Forces and second in command of the multinational military coalition in the Gulf War in 1990. He already knew Oman, having served there as a lieutenant in 1959 when he was awarded the Military Cross in what was known as the Jebel Akhdar campaign in the north of the country. Now you can almost make it out from the photo, but he has the most penetrating blue eyes, and they darted everywhere as he paced up and down his office, jabbing at maps and photographs on the wall, as he told me a little bit about the problems in Dhofar, what the regiment was doing there, why my role was going to be critical. It was an operation known as Operation Storm, and in his book, Looking for Trouble, he writes that Operation Storm was of such strategic importance that it will go down in history as a significant battle for Western supremacy and the fight against communism. And yet, the Dhofar War in Oman is perhaps one of the world's least well-known conflicts of modern time. So that begs the question, what was Operation Storm? And why on earth did the SAS need a vet? So first of all, let's have a look at the strategic importance of Oman. It lies between the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea in the northern Indian Ocean. Muscat is the capital up here in the north, and Dhofar is its southern province in the south, with Salalah as its main town. The province is about 100,000 square kilometres, which makes it about the same size as the United Arab Emirates or Hungary. It was very poorly developed at the time, and the old Sultan, Said bin Taimur, while very friendly to the British and with a small circle of quite senior and experienced British advisors, had nevertheless refused to modernize the country that he'd ruled autocratically for 40 years. As I mentioned just now, there had been an insurgency in the north in the 1950s, and a rebellion in Dhofar had begun in 1962. That rebellion was at first internal, although there were many disaffected Omanis living overseas. But the situation was aggravated by two external factors in 1967. The first was the Six-Day War that affected the whole region. The second was the decision of Harold Wilson to pull the last British troops out of the state of Aden, formerly the Aden Protectorate, on Dhofar's southwestern border, so conceding control to the Marxists. Aden then became known as the People's Democratic Republic of the Yemen, and it was the first communist country in the Arab world. The Marxist groups exploited the by now serious unrest in Dhofar and progressively infiltrated, with the aim of engaging and disrupting the tribal systems that had existed there for centuries. And by the late 1960s, much of Dhofar had been overrun, and the main town Salalah, where Said bin Taimur had lived since an assassination attempt some years previously, was surrounded. His British advisors realized the gravity of the situation. If Dhofar fell, there could well be a domino effect up the coast of Oman and along the Arabian Gulf. And the fall of Oman's mountainous peninsula, Masandam, could easily threaten shipment of oil to the west. So then, in 1970, there was a relatively bloodless palace coup, and Qaboos overthrew his father. At the time, this could only have happened with covert UK support, and I think credit has to be given to Ted Heath's government for deciding to act not only against a firm ally, but at a time when all forms of perceived colonialism were considered unacceptable. The 30-year-old Qaboos had been educated in Britain. He'd trained at Sandhurst and he'd served in the Cameronians, Scottish Rifles. However, after he returned to Oman, his paranoid father had kept him very tightly constrained, almost under house arrest, in Al Hisn Palace in Salalah. He was, however, allowed access to a few selected individuals approved by his father, including one of his old Sandhurst contemporaries, Tim Landon. At that time was serving as an intelligence officer in Dhofar. And in this way, and with the cautious and in some cases even reluctant agreement of the Sultan's British advisors, an Omani British coup was engineered. Said bin Taimur was quietly relocated to the Dorchester, where he ended his days, and he was succeeded by his son, now His Majesty Sultan Qaboos. Now, the new Sultan had many challenges, not least from members of his family. But the British officered Sultan's armed forces immediately backed him, so he was able rapidly to take control and start the Renaissance with a 5-point plan. And this can be roughly summarized as follows. There'd be a general amnesty offered to opponents. There was to be a rapid expansion of the army with rigorous military opposition to any who rejected the amnesty. There was to be irrevocable confirmation that Dhofar was Oman's southern province, sending a clear signal to PDRY and its communist supporters. There was to be a vigorous nationwide program of development and immediate introduction of counter-insurgency measures. Now, these were essential, as Qaboos had not only to win the war, but also to bring his people with him. Due to his father keeping him under wraps, his population hardly knew anything about him. As Richard Dannett writes in the foreword, the key to winning any counter-insurgency campaign is the support of the local people, winning their hearts and minds. So why the SAS? Well, the SAS were brought in to operate alongside the rapidly increasing and greatly enlarged Sultan's armed forces that comprised Omani and Baluchi regiments, led mostly by seconded and contract British officers. There was also international support from Iran and Jordan, who provided troops. And the aim was to recruit local tribesmen across the war zone, gain their trust, turn them, and train them to fight. And it was turning the local tribesmen that was key. Qaboos took the calculated step of arming the converts, forming them into local militia units called Furka forces, rewarding them well, caring for their families, and protecting them from the remaining guerrillas. It was a tactic that the British had used with some success in the 1950s in the Malaya campaign. Now, Operation Storm's counter-insurgency strategy was developed in 1970, shortly after the coup, by Colonel Johnny Watts, who was then commanding officer of 22 SAS. He identified 4 main tactics for defeating the rebels in parallel with the military campaign. And these can be loosely summarized as hearts and minds and massive civil aid, intelligence gathering, veterinary assistance and improved animal husbandry, medical assistance. So why was veterinary assistance so critical to this strategic plan? Well, the target population in the war zone were pastoralist farmers. It was a poor, livestock-based economy. The population of Dhofar province at this time was probably around 40 or 50,000 people, mostly living either in the coastal towns or tribes on the surrounding hills, known as the Jebel. The Jabali tribes were, and are, fiercely independent, with a strong Muslim faith, and they speak unwritten Semitic languages, which are closer to Amharic than they are to Arabic. The key thing is their animals were everything, essentially a walking bank. And it's extraordinary nowadays to think that under the extreme conditions in which they lived, a camel might well be valued above a daughter. And it was this centuries-old, deeply entrenched tribal system that the rebel movements, supported by China and the Soviet Union, were determined to eradicate along with religion. And to this end, they ruthlessly and cruelly murdered some local imams and used terror and intimidation on non-cooperative tribes. Said bin Taimur did try to stop the rebellion, but he wasn't willing to invest in the necessary military resources, and so had very little success. He appeared to distrust his people, even though his Dhofari wife, who was Qaboos's mother, Mazoon, was from Dhofar's powerful Al-Marshani tribe. So in an attempt to counter the revolt, Said bin Taimur authorized the blocking of wells, refused to provide better defenses for his people or even medical or food aid, and simply wouldn't negotiate even with the more moderate rebels. Inevitably, the population became more and more desperate. They were struggling to survive, and the atheistic communists at least offered money, guns, and education, although this was obviously largely in the form of indoctrination. It was a hard price to pay for deeply religious tribal communities. So, enter the British Army training team, known as BAT. And there is actually a bat motif of the flying variety on the tie, a commemorative tie. BAT was essentially a cover name for the SAS deployed in Operation Storm. The name implied that they were there to advise the local military, but of course they were also operational. The BAT vet, me, was tasked with helping the animals of what had become a very battered but animal-dependent population. And the aim, I imagine, was to show that unlike his father, Sultan Qaboos understood the desperate needs of his people for food, water, healthcare, not only for themselves, but also for their animals. So this is the Salalah into which I landed, and you may just about be able to make out the faint outline of the Jebel, the hills that rise about 1,000 meters or more and are about 10 to 20 kilometers deep. And we landed at RAF Salalah. This had been built in 1928 as a staging post for aircraft flying from Aden to Bahrain and beyond. And I'm pretty sure this is the same signpost that was put there in 1928. Nearby, there was a substantial operating base for the Sultan's armed forces, and this was also the headquarters of BAT. And this is where A Squadron of 22 SAS were based, with the ops room on the left, communications on the right, and you can see the map on the wall around which all members of the squadron, not on the hill, gathered every evening at 1800 hours for a situation report known as prayers from our squadron commander, Major, later Colonel, Paddy King-Fretz. Now, I have to say that Paddy is still a good friend. He served 2 tours with A Squadron in Dhofar, but these postings were no sinecures. During my tour, which was his first, the squadron of about 60 lost 2 men. Curly Kent, who died in March 74, and Captain Simon Garthwaite, who was killed in action on the 12th of April. Now, Paddy has what I would call the classic SAS characteristics of calmness in a crisis, inner strength, and a total trust in himself and his men. I was obviously totally outclassed, but consider myself to have been so fortunate to have had the opportunity to serve with Paddy and his superb squadron, and to have been welcomed so warmly as one of the team. Now, Paddy was staying with us in Suffolk in 2019 when we were both interviewed about the insurgency for the Oman Archives in St Antony's College, Oxford. And I thought I'd show you a 45-second clip from Paddy's interview in which he explained something about the risks and the difficulties dealing with the tribal people.
In that war zone, most things were at a high risk level. I mean, every time he went out on ops was very high risk. Just like the young lads in Afghanistan, a couple of years ago, very high risk indeed. But generally speaking, there were good relations, very good relations, which there had to be. There had to be.
And trust.
Because from as soon as the fighting clearing the Adu, which is the enemy, was over, the Hearts and Minds campaign began, which is really what it was all about. All we did was to clear the air so that the Hearts and Minds could get in with the wells, with the animal husbandry, with the schools, the medical clinics and that sort of thing.
Now, my predecessor as Bat Vet was Major Scott Moffat, sadly no longer with us. I arrived in Salalah in January 1974, and we had only a 3-day handover, after which I would be on my own. Scott was very encouraging and supportive, but clearly couldn't wait to be home. It was a challenging prospect to be left as the only vet in the province, and with no one to turn to other than sending a signal back to UK for advice. Now, Scott explained that my responsibilities were in 3 parts. Dhofar is ringed here in the top left. The 3 geographical aspects of the job were first Salalah and the small coastal villages to the east, such as Arzat and Tarka and Mirbat. The plains, shown in light grey, where refugees escaping from the hills lived until they could be processed and integrated. Now, by 1974, most of the enemy had been cleared or at least neutralised across much of the plains, but there was still a lot of activity on the Jebel, which is shown in dark grey. And this is where the BAT units were located. As you can see from the scale at the bottom of the slide, we're talking about 150 kilometres east to west and some 10 kilometres deep. This oddly named location, Midway, was a former drilling camp, and there was a strategically important and frequently ambushed track shown as a dotted line between Salalah and 70 kilometres up to Midway. But Midway was actually midway to nowhere, as the next stop was Muscat, 1,000 miles to the north across desert wasteland known as the Empty Quarter. Now, on the day I arrived in Salalah, a local wali or governor had been in touch and requested a visit from the Bat Vet, as goats were dying. Scott had tasked a helicopter, so at dawn on my second day, we set off for this fishing village that until recently had been in enemy hands. Now, I took with me, some of you may remember, an 8mm movie camera. And I'd like to show you a 90-second clip of Suda in 1974. You'll see Scott, you'll see the wali, you'll see our PSYOPs interpreter, and a lot of curious bystanders.
يا ملك في الأرض ما بين البشر في ديارك عز ما فيها طبيع يا ملك في الأرض ما بين البشر في ديارك عز ما فيها طبيع ومستهم جريع فيها قبيع وبسهم جريع صاب سهم وسط قلبي.
Well, I hope that gives you a bit of a feel for the sort of conditions under which we were operating. As you may have seen, unfortunately, there were not a lot of goats there, as the survivors of whatever it was that was killing them were all out grazing on the hill. But on the positive side, it did demonstrate good hearts and minds. There were 2 vets, a bat interpreter, a veterinary assistant, and a helicopter, all responding within 24 hours to a request from the public. Well, the following day, Scott flew out and I was on my own. But I did have my local team. Now, you may have spotted the guy in the red turban carrying my camera case in the clip. He was Salah, my number 1 veterinary dresser, and here he is with Hafith, who is the number 2 veterinary dresser in lime green. And in the middle is Ahmed. He was the veterinary dresser from Tarka, who for some reason that was never clearly explained to me had spent time in Grimsby. But these boys and the handful of others that we had around the province knew the ropes and knew far more about sorting out the problems on the ground than I did. They all spoke some English, and Hafith also spoke the Jabali language, which was very useful. Our base in Salalah was owned by Dhofar Development Department that was administered by a handful of British advisors under the authority of the governor of Dhofar province, Sheikh Brake, who had actually been one of the leaders of the coup against Said bin Taimur. Unlike our predecessors who had to operate literally out of a rucksack, the Bat Vet was now provided with a good functional office, small laboratory, stores, and our own, admittedly rather tired Land Rover. And on most days, patients would just roll up. The office was sited in a beautiful garden. Bir bint Ahmed means Ahmed's daughter's garden, and it was just on the outskirts of the town. Here there was copious water thanks to the annual monsoon, which is known as the Kharif, that hits Dhofar every year from June to September, transforming the brown mountainous landscape to a luscious green for just a few weeks. But it also provides a plentiful water supply to Salalah throughout the year. And the well-filled water table allowed us at Bir bint Ahmed to take a crop of alfalfa every 2 to 3 weeks. The water was raised from boreholes and distributed by an ancient Persian falage system that had been in use for centuries. We also had a herd of Jabali cattle. These were really tough, wiry animals, tiny but strong. Milking time was a rodeo. The Dhofar Development Department had reasonably tried to cross these indigenous and relatively disease-resistant cattle with better producing Western bulls, such as Friesians and Herefords. So they built bull pens and imported some bulls. Sadly, the bulls proved to be far too massive for the small Jabali cattle, and they wisely refused to be mounted by these hunky immigrants. The scheme was abandoned. As a result, I inherited some rather forlorn bulls who spent their days eyeing up the local talent, grazing just a few meters away. Now, I don't have time to relate it here, but we had better luck later on when I was tasked with importing some rather smaller Baran and Saiwal cat bulls from East Africa. And from Bir bint Ahmed, I would travel out in my old Land Rover to see my patients in the town. Salalah town was beginning its new dawn by 1974, and roads, schools, hospital, and new housing were rapidly being built. But many parts of the town remained largely as they had been for 1,000 years. Most houses were walled, and inside their courtyards the animals were kept. And these were my patients: donkeys, goats, camels mostly. none of which had featured very much in my veterinary degree course that I'd completed less than a year before. So there was a lot of learning on the job and trying to apply general principles, and I'm afraid not always with success. I mentioned the plains, and that's where the refugees coming down from the hill would be based until they were fully integrated. And as you can see, the accommodation was improvised and very primitive, and the animals invariably lived with their owners. And the next short clip shows one such unit and some of the patients that I dealt with in this rather unsettling refugee area. Quite interesting to see how the goat's being restrained by that chap's very strong big toe. The brand mark, which you can see there, it could be a local tribal brand, or in this case it's more likely a technique that's known as wussum, which is an ancient form of treating disease using a hot iron. This is obviously a fairly light application, but sometimes the animals, and sad to say even children, were severely burned. It's easy for us to criticize, but we have to remember this was a society with no access to modern medicine, so traditional treatments were the norm. And in passing, it's interesting to think that even today, some people in the West will still elect to fire a horse's legs in the belief that it will strengthen damaged tendons. Now, about 15 kilometers west of Salalah was the small harbour of Rezout. It was very small, with a single jetty, and you can see the wooden dhows waiting to unload. Today, it has morphed into one of the region's biggest container ports. But back then, I or one of my assistants would come to Rezout nearly every day, specifically to visit the quarantine station that was situated on the hill above the port. And with the province housing an army and support staff of up to 10,000 men, a lot of meat was required. Oman couldn't produce that volume, so it was imported from Africa, mainly at that time from Somalia. Sheep and goats by the thousand were shipped in by dhow. They were packed into dhows, maybe 5 or 6 layers deep. This is a motorized dhow, this is a big one, but many of them were much smaller and even under sail. And the British harbour master, Jeremy Raybould, who was a former naval officer, would not let them land until they'd been inspected and signed off. It wasn't an easy job, but it was crucial to keep infectious diseases out of the country. Thousands of sheep from East Africa, mixing freely with local animals, could have decimated the indigenous flocks. So imported animals were quarantined for 21 days and regularly inspected. Now, as the culture required fresh meat, animals could be slaughtered here and the carcasses removed before the 21-day quarantine period was up. The whole thing was a logistical exercise, but a vital one that was enforced and actually worked remarkably well. And it was rewarding to see that when I visited in 2019 that the principles are still being applied, although it has to be admitted with a rather more substantial quarantine station. My third responsibility was in the war zone, to care for the animals owned by the pastoralist tribes. There were 6 or 7 locations on the Jebel, in each of which a 4-man bat unit was deployed. 4 of them are shown here. And as Paddy said, the bat teams were there to remove the enemy and allow the hearts and minds to proceed. So, at each location, a well would be drilled, often hundreds of meters deep. Troughs would be built, so watering points existed for the pastoralists to bring in their animals. This provided the perfect opportunity for the BAT and the civil aid teams to talk to the families, and in my case, to provide veterinary care for the animals, and sometimes for the humans as well. We'd travel up either by helicopter or here by Skyvan, which was an amazing, sturdy 20-seat aircraft that resembled a flying shoebox. It seemed to be able to land and take off in the most unlikely places, and it carried people, animals, feed, oil drums of fuel, often all at the same time, on the short hops to and from the Jebel locations. And on arrival, we'd be met by a member of the BAT team, and we'd be briefed where and where not to go, and when, what stag duties we were to do, and the general SOPs for the base. There was no rank, as everyone in the squadron was on first-name terms, apart from Paddy, who was boss. So I did as I was told, and I found these men quite amazing to work with. This is a typical base, a 4-man basher, with a sort of space for a visitor and an assistant, and quite a few rats and scorpions and other creatures. The Batmen talked very happily in the evenings under beautiful skies with lots of shooting stars. There were also unexpected tracer bullets and night fire from rather jittery Iranian pickets posted at various locations around us. But it was at locations like this that the civil aid teams worked, putting up small mosques, schoolrooms, medical stations, and generally spreading the word along with practical help, providing the perfect opportunity for the government's Furka forces to get others to come over to the government side. There was a fourth part to my work, and it was a complete contrast, and that was taking care of the Sultan's animals. When I first arrived, Paddy had told me hearts and minds must extend to His Majesty. Caboose was very fond of his animals, and these included riding and racing horses and camels, a small zoo, many pedigree dogs, and His Majesty's mother's cat. Now here you can see some of the animals at the top of the old royal stables with the horses tethered under lovely, evocative, tranquil barusti shading. And that was a place called Watia before they moved to a huge concrete complex, which they're still in at Seeb. I did have some very embarrassing experiences treating the royal animals, but I'm afraid I don't have time to go into these toe-curling episodes tonight, but they are, of course, in the book. But as I really was the last bat vet, this posed a bit of a problem. Who would look after His Majesty's animals after I left? Well, enter the General. The formidable General Tim Creasy, known as the Bull. He was commander of the Sultan's Armed Forces in 1974 on loan from the British Army. He went on to be Commander-in-Chief UK Land Forces before returning to Oman on contract as Chief of the Defence Staff in 1981. And his daughter Pauline Daniels lives in Suffolk and kindly gave me this splendid photograph of her father in Oman. Now, junior officers in BAT did not tend to meet the General, so I was surprised one day to be summoned to Muscat to see him. He said he'd been asked to sound me out. Should the opportunity arise, would I be interested in completing my short service commission in Oman, working for the palace under Colonel Said Salem, the President of the Royal Court. Now, Said Salem was a very interesting chap. He was the first Omani ever to be commissioned, and in fact he was the only commissioned Omani before the coup, and he led the Oman contingent at the coup. So he had this very important high office as President of the Royal Court. If I agreed, I would be transferred to the regular Army Reserve and I would return to Oman in due course as Palace Vet. The General said this would have his full support if it was something I wanted to do. was actually a bit of a no-brainer, wasn't it? So I accepted, but that is another story. So, what was it all about? Well, to quote again from Richard Dannett, psychological operations only succeed if they do not alienate populations that are already frightened, confused, deprived of basic necessities, and unstable. Most people are looking for little more than peace, political stability, order, and a better future for themselves and their families. This very poignant comment follows. Kicking the door in uninvited, as the multinational force did in Iraq, does not pave the way to winning the minds and the hearts of the people, as events have shown. Dhofar was a tough war. It was strategically won, but at considerable expense. And we mustn't forget that well over 2,000 people died. Omani, Iranian, Jordanian, British and other troops, but also, of course, very many civilians. But I like to think our hearts and minds model did contribute positively to the outcome, even if only in a small way. Here you see in 1974, me giving some medication to Jabali boys for their cars in Tawiyater in Dhofar. And here I am again treating a sick goat at a livestock bazaar in Dhofar. And then, 40 years later, exactly the same approach in Helmand, where Afghans at a livestock bazaar in central Helmand, and British Army vet Captain Joe Lowe, and you can see her treating a sick goat at a livestock bazaar in Helmand. But here is Paddy with his take on what we did.
Without patting the regiment on the back or anything else, the mere fact that the Dhofar campaign began very well with the overthrow of the Sultan and very nearly the overrunning of the land to complete success. And look at Oman now, what an ally we've got there.
Yeah.
And what an ally indeed that we have. And long may good relations continue. Finally, when Nicola and I were back in Oman in 2019, I was able to track down one of my old assistants, Hafith, who I hadn't seen for 45 years. The others I learned had all died. Hafith shown here on the left in his distinctive green suit, and here we are again together in 2019. Now, last year my son Ben was in Salalah and went to call on Hafith and his family. But very sadly, shortly after that visit, Hafith too died. So, in closing, I'd like to dedicate this talk to Salah and Hafith and the rest of the BAT team. Thank you for listening. I hope those of you who haven't read the book will dip into it and hopefully enjoy it. Most of the photos that I've shown in this presentation are mine, but I must acknowledge with many thanks those who have also kindly lent me use some of theirs. There are copies of the paperback available, which Rosemary will be very happy to let you have, and every purchase will benefit that wonderful charity, Help for Heroes. Thank you.